The shareholders want someone more appropriate for this company. The sentence landed softly, almost politely, but the silence that followed inside the Manhattan boardroom felt heavy enough to crack glass. Naomi Carter didn't blink. At the far end of the 40-foot walnut conference table, Edward Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his navy suit and slowly slid a cream-colored envelope across the polished surface toward her. The envelope stopped inches from Naomi's hand. Around the room, nobody moved. Nobody reached for their water. Nobody looked directly at her anymore. Rain streaked down the floor-to-ceiling windows behind them, turning the New York skyline into a blur of gray steel and pale light. Naomi sat perfectly still in her black tailored blazer, one hand resting beside a leather portfolio, the other lightly touching the edge of the chair. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass walls surrounding the executive floor. 23 stories above Midtown, the room smelled faintly of espresso, paper, and expensive cologne. Edward leaned back slowly. "You've had a respectable run," he said. "But investors are nervous." A man near the center of the table nodded too quickly. Another cleared his throat and pretended to review quarterly reports he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the envelope again. Resignation papers. Prepared before she even walked into the room. The realization didn't sting nearly as much as the familiarity of it. She had seen this look before. In law school classrooms where professors confused silence for weakness. In elevators where executives handed her empty coffee cups without looking at her face. In the lobby of this exact building 20 years ago when her mother wore gray janitorial gloves and worked overnight shifts polishing marble floors while white businessmen stepped around her like furniture. Naomi could still remember sitting near the vending machines after midnight, waiting for her mother to finish cleaning offices upstairs. The building had smelled exactly the same back then. Cold air conditioning, lemon disinfectant, burnt coffee. Edward folded his hands calmly. The board believes the company requires a different image moving forward. Different image. Naomi almost smiled at the phrase. Corporate language had always been designed to hide ugly things beneath polished words. Outside, thunder rolled softly across Manhattan. One of the younger board members finally spoke. "Wall Street is reacting emotionally right now," he said carefully. "And frankly, your leadership style has become divisive." Naomi looked at him for the first time. His voice weakened instantly beneath her gaze. Divisive. Another coded word. Another polished blade wrapped in silk. Edward tapped the envelope once with 2 fingers. "You can sign now and leave with dignity," he said. The room fell quieter somehow. Even the rain seemed distant. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the resignation papers again. Her face revealed nothing. No anger. No embarrassment. No fear. That composure unsettled them more than shouting ever could have. A woman near the corner adjusted the diamond bracelet around her wrist and finally muttered, "This doesn't have to become unpleasant." Naomi slowly removed a pair of reading glasses and placed them carefully beside her portfolio. The soft click against the table echoed through the room. Then she looked up. Calm, steady, controlled. "Are you all finished?" she asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Somewhere beyond the glass walls, a phone rang in a distant office before abruptly stopping. Edward gave a thin smile. "Naomi," he said, almost sympathetically now, "you were never supposed to sit at the head of this company forever." Naomi held his gaze for several long seconds. Then, very slowly, she reached for her phone instead of the envelope. And for the first time that morning, uncertainty flickered across Edward Whitmore's face. Edward Whitmore stared at Naomi's phone as if the small black screen had suddenly become dangerous. The uncertainty in his pale blue eyes vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same cold confidence he had carried into the meeting that morning. He straightened the silver watch beneath his cuff and forced a smile that did not quite reach his face. "Calling your attorney will not change the board's decision," he said. Naomi did not answer immediately. Her thumb moved once across the screen before she placed the phone face down beside her portfolio. The movement was calm, almost delicate, but several people around the table shifted uneasily anyway. Rain continued crawling down the windows behind them in thin, silver lines. Beyond the glass, Manhattan looked distant and blurred beneath the storm clouds gathering over the Hudson. Naomi folded her hands together lightly. "You already made your decision before I entered this room," she said quietly. So let us not pretend this is a discussion. No one spoke. A man near the center of the table adjusted his tie for the third time in less than 5 minutes. Another avoided eye contact entirely, focusing instead on the quarterly earnings packet sitting untouched in front of him. The tension inside the boardroom had changed now. It no longer felt like victory. It felt like waiting for something unseen. Edward exhaled slowly through his nose. This company cannot survive another unstable quarter, he said. Our investors expect confidence. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Confidence, she repeated softly. Interesting word. Her reflection shimmered faintly across the dark surface of the table. 40 stories of corporate ambition surrounded them in steel and glass. But Naomi suddenly remembered a very different version of this building. She remembered being 12 years old, sitting cross-legged beside a janitor cart at 2:07 in the morning while her mother scrubbed winter salt from the marble lobby downstairs. Naomi had spent nights finishing homework under fluorescent lights while executives walked past without seeing either of them. Sometimes security guards offered her crackers from vending machines. Sometimes they did not notice her at all. Her mother used to whisper the same sentence every night before they rode the subway home to South Chicago. Invisible people learn how the world really works. Naomi never forgot it. Edward's voice pulled her back into the room. You should think carefully before turning this into something ugly. Naomi looked directly at him now. Her face remained composed, beautiful in a restrained and effortless way that made the older board members uncomfortable because it carried neither apology nor fear. Her dark curls rested neatly against the collar of her ivory blouse. Diamond stud earrings caught the pale overhead light each time she moved. Ugly, she asked. No, Edward. Ugly was deciding what kind of leader I could be before I ever spoke. One of the board members leaned forward sharply. Nobody is talking about race. Naomi's eyes shifted toward him. Of course not, she said. That is usually how these conversations work. Silence swallowed the room again. Somewhere overhead, thunder rolled low across the city. Edward tapped the resignation envelope impatiently. Sign the papers, he said. Walk away with your reputation intact. Naomi glanced down at the envelope one final time. Cream-colored paper. Gold embossed company logo. Prepared neatly in advance like a funeral invitation. Then she looked back up. Calm. Controlled. Untouchable. You know what fascinates me most? She asked softly. Every person in this room spent years teaching me how power works. Her phone vibrated once against the polished wood table. The sound was quiet, barely noticeable, yet every head turned toward it instantly. Naomi's gaze never left Edward Whitmore's face as she slowly reached for the phone and read the message appearing across the screen. And this time, when she smiled, it was not polite anymore. The smile on Naomi Carter's face unsettled the room more than anger ever could have. It was small, controlled, almost thoughtful, but it changed the temperature inside the boardroom instantly. Edward Whitmore noticed it first. His shoulders stiffened beneath his tailored suit as Naomi calmly locked her phone and placed it beside the untouched resignation papers. Rain hammered harder against the glass now, washing streaks of silver across the skyline behind her. The city lights below had already begun glowing through the storm like blurred gold beneath dark water. Naomi leaned back slightly in her chair. I received confirmation, she said softly. No one spoke. A board member near the windows cleared his throat. Another reached for his water glass, but stopped halfway there. The nervousness spreading around the room had become visible now, moving from person to person like a silent current. Edward forced a short laugh. Confirmation of what exactly? Naomi folded one leg neatly over the other. Every movement remained elegant, precise, controlled down to the smallest detail. That depends, she replied. Do you want the legal version or the honest one? Edward's jaw tightened. Enough games. Naomi looked toward the rain outside for a brief moment. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened glass. For years she had imagined this room differently. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted power for its own sake. But because she remembered every closed door that had taught her how quietly humiliation could shape a person. She remembered graduating top of her class from Columbia Law, while recruiters shook hands with white classmates standing beside her instead. She remembered investors complimenting her intelligence before asking whose assistant she was. Even after becoming chief executive officer, She still watched servers place coffee in front of white male executives first, as if authority naturally belonged to them. The memories no longer hurt the way they once had. They had hardened into something colder, something useful. Edward pushed the resignation envelope closer across the polished table. You are making this unnecessarily difficult. Naomi glanced down at the envelope one last time before sliding it gently back toward him using only 2 fingers. The motion was smooth enough to feel almost graceful. No, she said quietly. You made the mistake of thinking silence meant weakness. The room froze again. A younger board member finally snapped. You should be grateful you even had this position. The second the words left his mouth, regret flashed across his face. Naomi turned toward him slowly. Her expression did not change, but the stillness in her eyes made him shrink backward in his chair anyway. Grateful, she repeated softly. Interesting. Thunder rolled across Manhattan again, deeper this time. The lights overhead flickered once before stabilizing. Edward leaned forward now, abandoning the polished diplomacy he had worn all morning. You walked into a company built by people like us, he said coldly. Do not pretend you earned this place alone. Naomi studied him carefully for several long seconds. Then she nodded once. You are right, she said. The answer caught him off guard. I did not build this place alone. Her voice remained calm, almost reflective now. My mother helped build it too. She cleaned vomit out of executive bathrooms on this floor at 1:30 in the morning while men like you stepped around her without learning her name. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed loudly enough to be heard. Naomi's gaze drifted slowly across the board members seated around the massive walnut table. Invisible people built this company, she continued quietly. Assistants, custodians, receptionists, analysts you ignored until their ideas made you rich. Edward's face darkened. This emotional performance changes nothing. Naomi looked at her phone once more as another notification illuminated the screen. Then she placed both hands lightly on the table and spoke with terrifying calm. Actually, she said, it changes everything. At that exact moment, the boardroom doors opened behind them. Every head in the boardroom turned toward the doors at the same time. The sharp metallic click echoed softly through the silence before a woman in a charcoal gray suit stepped inside, carrying a leather binder against her chest. 2 men followed behind her, both from Hathaway and Price, the corporate law firm that represented major acquisitions across Wall Street. Naomi recognized the flicker of panic in Edward Whitmore's eyes before he buried it beneath irritation. This meeting is private, he snapped. The woman ignored him completely. Her heels crossed the marble floor in steady measured steps until she reached Naomi's side of the table. Rainwater shimmered across the windows behind them, turning the entire room silver and gray. Good morning, the attorney said calmly. I apologize for interrupting. She opened the binder carefully and placed several documents on the polished walnut table. Naomi did not touch them yet. She simply watched Edward. The older man remained seated, but his fingers tightened visibly around the armrest of his chair. What is this? He demanded. The attorney folded her hands neatly. Formal confirmation of shareholder transfer and emergency voting authority finalized at 7:12 this morning. The room went completely still. One board member actually laughed once under his breath, short and nervous, before realizing nobody else was laughing with him. Edward stared at the documents. That is impossible. Naomi finally spoke. No, she said softly. It was simply done quietly. The attorney slid a final page toward Edward. As of this morning, Ms. Carter now holds controlling interest through the Emerson Trust. Edward's face lost color almost instantly. Around the table, confusion spread like smoke. A younger executive grabbed the papers and began flipping through the legal language too quickly to process it properly. Another leaned toward him, whispering under his breath. Naomi remained perfectly composed through all of it. The storm outside deepened, low thunder vibrating faintly through the glass walls surrounding the executive floor. Edward looked up sharply. You planned this behind the board's back? Naomi's expression did not change. I learned from experts. The answer hit harder than shouting would have. Edward stood abruptly now, palms flattening against the table. You manipulated shareholders. No, Naomi replied. I listened to the ones you ignored. Silence swallowed the room again. The attorney calmly adjusted a stack of papers while Naomi slowly rose to her feet for the first time that morning. Her black heels clicked softly against the marble floor. The skyline behind her stretched across the rain-covered windows like blurred silver fire. She looked taller standing there, not because of power, but because she no longer carried the weight of needing anyone in that room to believe in her worth. 3 years ago, she said quietly, minority investors warned this board about reckless expansion strategies. You dismissed them. Her eyes moved from face to face around the table. 2 years ago, analysts from our South Side division proposed the restructuring plan that saved this company during the downturn. You took credit for it before laying half of them off. Nobody interrupted her now. Nobody even looked comfortable enough to move. Naomi's voice remained calm, almost painfully controlled. You called me emotional every time I objected to decisions that hurt employees while protecting executive bonuses. Edward shook his head once, furious now, but visibly uncertain underneath it. This is revenge. Naomi looked at him carefully. No, she said. Revenge would have looked much crueler than this. The room fell silent again except for the rain tapping steadily against the glass. One of the older board members finally removed his glasses and rubbed a trembling hand across his face. Another stared downward at the polished table as if avoiding eye contact might somehow make him invisible. Naomi reached for the resignation envelope still sitting near Edward's chair. She picked it up gently between 2 fingers, studied it for a moment, then placed it directly back in front of him. You should keep this, she said softly. Edward's jaw tightened so hard the muscles along his face twitched visibly. You cannot remove an entire board in one meeting. Naomi met his gaze without blinking. Actually, she replied, I already did. For several long seconds, nobody in the boardroom moved at all. The rain continued sliding down the glass walls and silver ribbons while the city beyond faded deeper into evening shadows. Edward Whitmore remained standing at the end of the conference table, one hand pressed flat against the polished wood as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. Across from him, Naomi Carter stood calm and motionless beneath the cold white lights, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. The resignation envelope still rested beside Edward's hand now, no longer a weapon, but something smaller, almost pathetic. One of the board members finally pushed back his chair with a soft scrape against the marble floor. This cannot be legal, he muttered weakly. The attorney beside Naomi opened her binder once more. The filings were approved by federal regulators at 6:48 this morning, she said calmly. Every document has been verified. Another silence settled over the room. It felt heavier this time, colder. The confidence that had filled the boardroom earlier had completely disappeared now, replaced by something far uglier. Fear. Edward slowly lowered himself back into his chair. The movement looked unnatural somehow, like a man realizing gravity had changed without warning. Who funded this? He asked quietly. Naomi clasped her hands lightly in front of her. People who were tired of being invisible. Edward laughed once under his breath, bitter and hollow. You expect me to believe investors handed you control out of loyalty? Naomi looked toward the rain-covered skyline again before answering. No, she said softly. They invested because I told them the truth while this board kept protecting itself. Several eyes around the table dropped immediately. A younger executive loosened his tie with trembling fingers. Another stared blankly at the quarterly projections glowing across the wall monitor, numbers that suddenly meant nothing anymore. Naomi walked slowly around the edge of the conference table now, her heels echoing softly through the room. Every movement remained measured and graceful, but the silence following her felt almost unbearable. You spent years confusing intimidation with leadership, she said quietly. You called people difficult whenever they challenged you. You called them emotional whenever they cared about consequences. Edward's jaw tightened again. Do not lecture me about leadership. I built this company. Naomi stopped beside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rainwater reflected faintly across her face beneath the city lights outside. No, she replied calmly. You inherited it. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Even the attorney beside Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. Edward stared at her in complete silence now. Naomi turned slowly back toward the table. You know what the strangest part is? She asked softly. None of you actually saw me until today. Nobody answered. The storm outside deepened, thunder rolling low across Manhattan like distant drums. Naomi's reflection shimmered against the dark glass behind her. Beautiful, controlled. Untouchable. I sat in this room for 3 years listening to men explain my own company to me, she continued. I watched executives dismiss brilliant analysts because they came from the wrong neighborhoods. I watched employees work 80-hour weeks while this board argued over private jet expenses. A board member near the end finally looked up. Shame had replaced arrogance on his face now. Naomi, he began quietly. She raised one hand slightly, stopping him without effort. No, she said. You already spoke. The room fell silent again. Somewhere outside the boardroom, phones rang faintly across distant executive offices. Naomi glanced toward the hallway beyond the glass doors where assistants and junior employees had slowly begun gathering, pretending not to watch. News traveled quickly on Wall Street, especially when powerful men started losing power. Edward rubbed one hand across his face before looking at Naomi again. For the first time all morning, his voice sounded old. What happens now? Naomi studied him carefully for several seconds. There was no cruelty in her eyes. No satisfaction either. Only clarity. Now, she said softly. Now this company finally belongs to the people who kept it alive while all of you were too busy protecting yourselves to notice them. Then she turned toward the attorney beside her. Prepare the termination notices. And this time, nobody argued. The boardroom stayed silent long after Naomi Carter finished speaking. Nobody reached for their phones anymore. Nobody whispered. The only sound left was the rain tapping steadily against the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. It sounded softer now somehow, less like a storm and more like time passing. Naomi stood near the windows with the city lights glowing behind her in blurred gold and silver reflections. The skyline stretched endlessly into the dark evening, cold and beautiful beneath the clouds. Inside the room, the air felt heavier than before. Not angry, not explosive, just still. Edward Whitmore sat motionless at the end of the conference table, staring at the termination papers the attorney had quietly placed in front of each board member. His shoulders looked smaller now beneath the expensive navy suit he had worn like armor only an hour earlier. One by one, the men and women around the table lowered their eyes toward the documents. Some looked stunned. Others simply looked tired. Naomi watched them without satisfaction. That was the part none of them understood. She had not spent years climbing through boardrooms dreaming about humiliating anyone. She had only wanted to survive in rooms that were designed to make people like her feel temporary, invisible, replaceable. The rain slid slowly down the glass beside her, catching fragments of city light as it fell. Naomi remembered another rainy night almost 20 years earlier when she was 13 years old sitting beside her mother in the subway after a double shift downtown. Her mother's hands had smelled faintly of bleach and lemon cleaner. Tiny cracks lined her knuckles from winter air and chemical soap. Naomi had fallen asleep against her shoulder while her mother whispered softly, "Never let people decide your worth before you open your mouth." At the time, Naomi had not fully understood what that meant. She understood now. A quiet rustling sound pulled her back into the present. One of the older board members removed his company badge slowly and placed it on the walnut table with trembling fingers. The small piece of silver plastic made a sharper sound than expected when it touched the wood. Another followed. Then another. The room filled with tiny metallic clicks as symbols of authority lost meaning one by one. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. There was something strangely sad about it. Not because they were losing power, but because so many of them had spent years believing power was the same thing as value. Edward finally spoke without looking at her. "You think this changes the world?" His voice sounded distant now, almost hollow. Naomi turned from the window slowly. Her reflection faded from the glass behind her as she stepped back toward the conference table. "No," she answered softly. "But maybe it changes this room." Nobody argued. Outside the boardroom walls, employees had gathered quietly near the executive hallway, pretending to work while stealing nervous glances through the glass. Assistants stood beside printers holding untouched folders. Junior analysts whispered beneath the pale office lights. News traveled fast in corporate towers, especially news that sounded impossible. Naomi noticed a young black receptionist near the elevators staring at her with wide, uncertain eyes. The girl could not have been older than 23. Naomi recognized the look immediately. Hope mixed with disbelief. The same expression she once wore herself. Naomi looked away gently before the moment became too personal. The attorney beside her closed the leather binder with a soft thud. "Security has been notified," she said quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody protested anymore. The fight had drained out of the room completely. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the back of her chair. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the polished table surface beneath the cold white lights overhead. Beautiful, calm, composed. But beneath all of it, exhaustion lingered quietly behind her eyes. Winning did not erase years of being underestimated. It only proved she had survived them. Edward slowly removed the silver watch from his wrist and stared at it for several seconds before slipping it into his pocket. The gesture felt strangely human now, smaller somehow. Naomi watched him carefully. Then she spoke one final time, her voice low enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "The people you ignored were always the reason this company survived." And once again, the room fell completely silent. The storm over Manhattan had begun to ease by the time the first board member finally stood to leave. No one said goodbye. No one tried to defend themselves anymore. The confidence that once filled the executive floor had disappeared completely, washed out of the room like dust beneath rainwater. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows, one hand resting lightly against the back of her chair, while the city glowed beneath the dark clouds outside. Yellow taxi lights drifted slowly through the wet streets far below. The room behind her felt quieter with every passing minute. One by one, former board members gathered their phones, leather folders, and expensive coats with the stiff, awkward movements of people suddenly unsure where they belonged anymore. Edward Whitmore stayed seated longer than the others. His silver hair looked dull beneath the overhead lights now, his expression distant and unreadable as he stared at the polished conference table that had once belonged entirely to him. Naomi did not rush him. She understood something most powerful people never learned. The loudest moments in life were rarely the ones that changed people. It was the silence afterward that stayed with them. A soft knock interrupted the stillness. The young black receptionist from the hallway stepped hesitantly into the room, carrying a tablet against her chest. "Miss Carter?" she asked quietly. Naomi turned toward her. Up close, the girl looked nervous enough to stop breathing. "The press is already downstairs," she said, "and employees are asking if the rumors are true." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you, Vanessa." The girl blinked in surprise. Most executives never remembered receptionists' names. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered softly before stepping back toward the door. But just before leaving, Vanessa glanced around the boardroom one last time. Her eyes paused briefly on Edward Whitmore sitting silently at the end of the table. Then they returned to Naomi. Something shifted across the young woman's face in that moment. Not excitement, not amusement, something deeper. Recognition. Naomi saw it immediately because she had once looked at successful black women the exact same way herself. Like proof survival was possible. The doors closed softly behind Vanessa. Edward finally exhaled through his nose and rose slowly from his chair. The movement seemed to age him 10 years all at once. He reached for his coat draped across the leather chair beside him before looking toward Naomi again. For the first time all evening, there was no arrogance left in his eyes. Only exhaustion. "You really think they will follow you?" he asked quietly. Naomi studied him carefully. "No," she answered. "I think they will finally feel seen." Edward looked down briefly, jaw tightening. Rainwater still traced faint silver patterns across the windows behind her. "You know," he said slowly, "when you first joined the company, I honestly thought you would fail within 6 months." Naomi did not react. "I know," she replied calmly. Edward gave a bitter half-smile. "And somehow that still does not make me the worst person in this room." Naomi walked slowly toward the conference table now, her heels echoing softly across the marble floor. "No," she said. "It just makes you someone who confused tradition with superiority for far too long." Edward lowered his eyes. The answer settled heavily between them. After several seconds, he gave a small nod. Not agreement exactly. More like surrender to a truth he could no longer avoid. Naomi reached down and straightened one of the empty chairs left crooked beside the table. The gesture felt strangely gentle after everything that had happened. "My mother used to clean this room every Thursday night," she said quietly. Edward looked up again, surprised. Naomi ran her fingers lightly along the polished wood surface. "She once told me rich men leave the biggest messes because they believe someone invisible will always clean them up afterward." A faint sound escaped Edward then. Not quite laughter, not quite regret. Something in between. He slipped his coat on slowly before heading toward the doors. But just before leaving, he stopped beside Naomi one final time. "You belonged here long before today," he admitted quietly. Naomi met his gaze without triumph. "I know," she said. And Edward Whitmore walked out of the boardroom alone. By the time Edward Whitmore disappeared down the executive hallway, the storm outside had finally begun to break apart above Manhattan. Rain still clung to the windows in thin, shimmering trails, but patches of light now pushed through the clouds, reflecting gold across the glass towers surrounding the city. Inside the boardroom, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt clean. Naomi Carter remained standing beside the long walnut conference table for several moments after the doors closed behind him. Empty leather chairs surrounded her like abandoned monuments to a world that had finally cracked open. Half-finished cups of coffee sat cooling beside untouched reports and silver pens. The room still smelled faintly of expensive cologne and rain-damp wool coats. Naomi slowly exhaled through her nose and closed her eyes for one brief second. The exhaustion hit her all at once now that nobody remained to fight anymore. Her shoulders loosened slightly beneath the black blazer she had worn like armor all day. The attorney beside her quietly gathered documents into neat stacks before pausing. "You handled that with more grace than most people would have," she said softly. Naomi opened her eyes again. "Grace was never for them," she replied. "It was for me." The attorney studied her for a moment before giving a small, respectful nod. Then she left the room quietly, allowing the doors to close with a soft, muted click behind her. Naomi stood alone now. Outside the glass walls, employees still lingered nervously throughout the executive floor, pretending to organize paperwork while stealing cautious glances toward the boardroom. Nobody wanted to be the first person to approach her. Power had shifted too suddenly. People were still learning how to breathe around it. Naomi walked slowly toward the windows overlooking the city. The lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beneath her feet, glowing warm against the wet streets below. She rested one hand lightly against the cool glass. 20 years earlier, her mother had stood inside this same building mopping floors after midnight, while executives argued over million-dollar deals above her head. Naomi remembered hiding inside empty conference rooms after hours, pretending the leather chairs belonged to her one day. Back then, the dream had not been wealth. It had been dignity. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Naomi turned as Vanessa stepped hesitantly into the boardroom again, carrying a small cardboard box. "I found this outside Mr. Whitmore's office," the young receptionist said quietly. "I thought maybe you would want it." Naomi glanced down. Inside the box sat an old framed company photograph from nearly 20 years earlier. The edges of the frame were slightly worn. Naomi stepped closer slowly. Her breath caught for the first time all evening. In the background of the photograph, barely noticeable behind a group of executives posing during a holiday event, stood a woman in a gray janitor uniform pushing a cleaning cart. Naomi recognized her instantly. Her mother, younger, tired, invisible to everyone except Naomi. Vanessa looked nervous suddenly. "I am sorry. I did not mean to overstep." Naomi gently picked up the frame with both hands. Her fingers traced the edge of the glass carefully. "No," she said softly. "You did not." The city lights reflected faintly across the photograph, while Naomi stared at her mother's face. She remembered the long subway rides home, the tired smile, the cracked hands smelling faintly of bleach and peppermint gum. She remembered her mother telling her never to become bitter no matter how cruel people became, because bitterness lets them live inside you forever. Naomi finally looked back up at Vanessa. The young woman still stood nervously near the doorway, clutching her employee badge against her chest. Naomi smiled gently for the first time all day. Real this time. Warm. Human. "You belong here too," she said quietly. Vanessa blinked rapidly, eyes shining before she looked away embarrassed. "Thank you, Miss Carter." Naomi glanced once more around the empty boardroom before carefully setting the photograph at the head of the conference table where Edward Whitmore used to sit. Not as revenge, not as mockery, but as truth, the kind that had been invisible for far too long. The executive floor looked different after midnight. Quieter, softer. The endless noise of ringing phones and hurried footsteps had finally faded into distant echoes somewhere below the tower. Most of the office lights across Manhattan had gone dark now, leaving only scattered windows glowing against the wet night sky like tiny floating lanterns. Naomi Carter stood alone beside the windows of her new office, the city spread beneath her in silver and gold reflections across rain-soaked streets. Her blazer rested neatly over the back of a chair now, and the soft sleeves of her ivory blouse were rolled just above her wrists. The framed photograph of her mother sat on the edge of the desk beneath a small brass lamp casting warm light across the glass. Naomi stared at the photograph quietly. The younger version of her mother still stood in the background, pushing that same cleaning cart through the company hallway, while powerful men smiled for the camera without seeing her. Invisible. Yet somehow she had built part of this place too. Naomi reached down and lightly straightened the frame with careful fingers. The office smelled faintly of cedar wood, coffee, and rain drifting in through a slightly opened window somewhere down the hall. Beyond the glass walls, the city hummed softly beneath the storm's fading breath. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. Naomi turned as the night custodian stepped hesitantly into the office, carrying a trash bag over one shoulder. The older woman froze instantly when she realized who was standing there. "I am sorry, ma'am," she said quickly. "I did not know anyone was still here." Naomi smiled softly. "It is all right." The woman nodded awkwardly before moving toward the wastebasket near the door. Naomi watched her quietly for a moment. Gray curls framed the woman's tired face beneath the fluorescent lights. Comfortable walking shoes squeaked faintly against the polished floor. The sight pulled something deep inside Naomi's chest. Memory. Recognition. The custodian noticed the framed photograph on the desk and paused. "That woman looks familiar," she said softly. Naomi glanced toward the picture. "She used to work here," she replied. The woman stepped closer slowly, eyes widening with surprise. "Lord," she whispered. "That is Lorraine Carter." Naomi looked up immediately. "You knew my mother?" The woman smiled gently now. Everybody on the night shift knew Lorraine. She used to bring peppermint candy in her apron pocket and share it during breaks downstairs. Naomi felt warmth rise quietly behind her ribs. For a moment, the office no longer felt enormous and cold. It felt human. The custodian shook her head slowly while studying the photograph again. "She talked about you all the time," she said. "Said her daughter was going to run this city one day." Naomi looked down at the picture in silence. Outside, the rain had almost stopped completely now. Water still clung to the windows in delicate silver lines reflecting the glow of passing traffic 30 floors below. "She never got to see any of this," Naomi said quietly. The woman's expression softened. "Maybe she did," she replied. "Maybe not the office. But she saw who you were becoming." The words settled gently into the room. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, blinking once before looking back toward the city lights outside. The custodian quietly finished gathering the trash before moving toward the doorway again. But just before leaving, she paused beside Naomi. "Your mother would be proud tonight," she said softly. Then she disappeared down the hallway, pushing the cleaning cart through the silent executive floor. Naomi stood still for a long moment afterward, listening to the faint squeak of the wheels slowly fading into the distance. Then she walked toward the windows one final time. Below her, Manhattan shimmered beneath the rain like a city washed clean. Her reflection stared back at her in the dark glass. Calm, beautiful, strong, no longer asking permission to belong. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cool window and closed her eyes for a brief second as the first quiet hint of morning began glowing pale blue along the edge of the skyline.